The Nazi regime boasted of being pure, Aryan and traditionalist, but these assertions had a dark double side in the sexual realm. Unlike the principles that they proclaimed in public, the Germans had a very ambiguous relationship with what happened in their privacy. On the one hand, family values and tradition were promoted as a way of life, going so far as to severely punish any desire that was out of the ordinary. On the other, Adolf Hitler himself has a history of extreme lewd practices that included violence, sadomasochism, and an infamous obsession with his own niece. Next, we are going to reveal to you what they never told you about the Nazis' link to sexuality. If you are sensitive, we recommend that you be accompanied. Let's get started. Throughout the Second World War, all the armies attacked any civilian they found in their path, but the ones who suffered the most from the siege of the soldiers were the women. Sexual assaults or forced prostitution were the order of the day, and many of the German men satisfied their despair by resorting to these acts supposedly prohibited by their beliefs. Sexually transmitted diseases, such as syphilis and gonorrhea, were extremely common among Nazi fighters, resulting in heavy casualties. The Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS became alarmed when soldiers began to run short to resist the Allied advance. Each recruit was indispensable to protecting the Reich, and they could not afford to lose them due to their sexual behaviors. The solution to avoid unnecessary infections was allegedly devised by Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, who commissioned the Dr. Olin Hanneson to design an inflatable doll that was capable of satisfying the sexual appetites of the troops. The mass production of this doll met the following characteristics: to be of the Aryan race, to measure 1.80, and to be endowed with fleshy lips and prominent breasts that would make it appetizing to a young soldier who has not yet lost his virginity and who I dreamed of doing it in the arms of a Valkyrie. This escort was named after Borghild, a female figure from Norse mythology, and her beautiful face and voluptuous body were modeled after athletes Wilhelmina von Bremen and Annette Walter. However, the doll was not very successful among the young Nazis, since they preferred sexual abstinence rather than doing it with a plasticized girl. On the other hand, they found it very shameful to be captured by the enemy with this sexual artifact and branded as depraved. The Third Reich practiced a double standard, since they conceived prostitutes as antisocial elements that should be sent to concentration camps. On the other hand, they developed a system of brothels in the occupied territories and even in the same forced labor camps. Whenever possible, the Nazis used existing prostitution establishments, looking for local vendors to help them find girls. In most cases, they directly used prisoners of war who could not refuse, unless they wanted to end up in the gas chamber. These women were, without a doubt, sexual slaves. They underwent regular medical examinations, and if they were found to have contracted venereal diseases, they were supposedly hospitalized. However, on a daily basis, infected women were killed so as not to waste money and time. This brothel system had two objectives. The first, to have sexually satisfied soldiers to contain sexual assaults on local women. Second, brothels were a cure for homosexual relationships among soldiers, considered unnatural. This system was also at the service of Nazi ideology, which did not allow the mixing of races. Polish, Czech, and Soviet women belonged to the Slavic ethnic group, so the soldiers could have sexual relations with them inside the authorized brothels. In the case of the Jews and the Gypsies, they were completely excluded from this system since, according to the racial hierarchy of the Third Reich, they occupied the lowest rung and deserved to go to the extermination camps. On July 14, 1933, the Nazi dictatorship fulfilled one of its wildest dreams, the enactment of the law for the prevention of offspring with genetic diseases. This new regulation gave the state the power to racially cleanse its population, an extremely twisted measure. It was written by Falk Rüttke, a lawyer, Arthur Gutt, a doctor and director of public health affairs, and Ernst Ruden, a psychiatrist and one of the early leaders of the German racial hygiene movement. Men and women who suffered from any of these supposedly hereditary conditions had to undergo forced sterilization processes: mental weakness, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, genetic epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, genetic blindness, genetic deafness, severe physical deformity, and chronic alcoholism. They also included in their list people who had more than 1/8 of Jewish blood in their lineage. The German authorities, relying solely on prejudice and biased diagnoses, demanded the sterilization of approximately 400,000 German men and women. For men, the usual method of sterilization was vasectomy, and for women, tubal ligation, an overly invasive procedure that caused hundreds of deaths among German girls. Despite what was seen in the photographs, for Nazi ideologues and scientists, homosexuality was a hereditary malformation and had to be cured. Homosexual behaviors were classified as dangerous crimes against morality. To protect society from people with hereditary diseases, including the homosexual community, and to defend public morality, mass castrations were carried out, both voluntary and compulsory. But the incredible thing about this practice is that it was not intended as a punishment, but as a cure for what the Nazis believed was a genetic deviation. At Himmler's initiative, to try to cure homosexuality, suspected prisoners had to visit brothels once a week until they admitted that their sexual orientation was not natural. It is not possible to calculate their exact number, but it is estimated that around 2,000 men were sterilized. Very active in this field were Dr. Gustav Boeters and Dr. Karl-Heinz Rodenberg, who, in an article published in 1934, admitted to castrating some 60 moral delinquents several years before the law allowed it. The most extreme case was that of Dr. Karl Vernet, a Danish SS doctor. Vernet, who claimed to be able to cure homosexuality with a gland of his own making, enlisted the support of Himmler himself to carry out a series of sinister genetic experiments on inmates of the Buchenwald concentration camp. The trials consisted of implanting the gland in the groin area of 15 homosexual prisoners, a gland that supposedly released an artificial male sex hormone. The result of the tests consisted in the death of the majority of the prisoners subjected to the procedure. There are a number of rumors that weigh on the Führer's sexual behavior, which are as terrifying as everything around his figure. To begin with, we highlight the peculiar relationship that the dictator had with Jelly Robbel, his 17-year-old niece. The Führer became obsessed with her to the point of forcing her to have perverse carnal relations. The Nazi defector Otto Strasser even claims that Hitler enjoyed being urinated on by her niece. The girl had no choice but to give in to the strange requests of her powerful uncle. 6 years later, Robbel would be found dead with a gunshot wound to the chest in the dictator's apartment. At just 23 years old, the young woman ended her life, or that is what the official version says, although it is suspected that she was murdered and that the Nazis destroyed all the evidence that associated the Nazi leader with this incestuous trend and taste for the most depraved sex. The deep homoerotic connotation that was in the aesthetics of the Third Reich chosen by Hitler was always controversial. Behind those whips, uniforms and black leather clothing there seemed to be a sexual preference towards the male gender, and a sadomasochistic drive was glimpsed.
He was the Führer. She a loyal German, ready to do her duty. But she wasn't prepared for what Hitler had in mind. She told Zeisler,
"He suddenly fell on the floor and begged me to kick him."
She looked down at the Führer lying naked at her feet. She was ready to do her duty for the Führer, but she was sickened. She told Zeisler,
"He pleaded with me. He condemned himself as unworthy, and I finally gave in to his wishes."
That is why another of the names in the promiscuous life of the Führer is that of Renate Müller, a German film actress, victim of Hitler's repeated perversions. The young woman, who according to official history threw herself from her balcony committing suicide, supposedly died after the dictator had a sadomasochistic sexual relationship with her, ending her life in the process. Another of the rumors that haunt the figure of Hitler is that he was addicted to pornography. Apparently, he had a voyeuristic drive that led him to invite prostitutes to his mountain refuge. There are many myths and legends that have arisen around the lewd and perverse behavior of this fearsome historical figure. A long list of assumptions, nightmares and depravities that can never be fully verified.
Homosexuality condemned, uncontrolled prostitution, and a dictator addicted to sex. In today's video, we're going to delve into issues of sexuality that occurred in fascist Italy during the 20th century. Get ready for a journey back in time and to explore the perversities of the authoritarian rule of Il Duce. Welcome to military history. During fascism in Italy, a period ruled by the dictator Benito Mussolini, homosexuality was harshly persecuted, and those identified as homosexuals were confined to an island within Italian territory. In addition to the horrendous racial laws that severely restricted the civil rights of Italian Jews and other ethnic minorities, homosexuals suffered a devastating impact during fascism. Considered contrary to traditional male ideals, homosexuals in fascist Italy were subjected to discrimination and oppression. Prior to and during World War II, in totalitarian Italy, homosexual men were labeled as degenerates and often assaulted by authorities. While no discriminatory laws against sexual dissidents were enacted, the government created an atmosphere where open manifestations of homosexuality could be forcefully suppressed with the approval of the population. Chilling statements from authorities of that time included, "We realize that public dances, beaches, and mountain places are frequented by many of these sick people, and young people of all social classes seek their company. These accursed effeminates are corrupting our people." With this backward and violent mentality, authorities were determined to stop what they perceived as the spread of degeneration and to contain a sexual aberration that offends morality and is disastrous for public health and racial improvement. For this reason, gay men hid, as recounted in the following testimony.
Si teneva sempre nascosto, se ne parlava con scherno, con smorfie, che non era possibile dire io sono omosessuale.
According to alleged good customs, these men with different sexual orientations were seen as a menace that needed to be attacked and eradicated. Not only did the gay community itself face rejection, but homosexuals also undermined the image that dictator Benito Mussolini wanted to project of Italian masculinity. Fascism was considered by its proponents as a virile regime. Therefore, Italians saw themselves as strong, masculine, and of a superior race. They considered it impossible for homosexuality to exist in a fascist regime. Since Mussolini believed that this condition was a foreign vice imported from Germany or England, unrelated to Italian blood. Hence, the strategy was to cover up the issue as much as possible. In 1938, dozens of men believed to be homosexuals in Catania were arrested and sent into internal exile. An archipelago south of Italy became the setting where authorities sought to erase gay men from the national map. About 600 kilometers away, on the island of San Domino in Tremitis, these prisoners endured harsh detention conditions. They were expelled from their homes solely based on suspicion and interned on an island as if they were mangy animals. These groups of men arrived in handcuffs treated like criminals, and were housed in large Spartan dormitories without electricity or running water. During their transfer to the cells, soldiers mistreated them, beat them, spat on them, and derogatorily called them féminelles, a disparaging term for effeminate men. Once installed on the island, they were forced to perform forced labor for meager pay, eventually being considered to some extent as slaves. The prisoners knew that the exposure of their homosexuality had caused shame and anguish to their families in deeply conservative cities and towns. In those days in Italy, being a gay man meant not being able to leave one's home, let alone make oneself noticeable. The police would arrest and punish anyone displaying such behaviors. It is profoundly ironic that in Italy during that time, they could only find a certain degree of freedom on a prison island. For the first time in their lives, these men were in a place where they could be themselves, free from the stigma that normally surrounded them in their devoutly Catholic country in the 1930s. They were confined under prison rules, but some found that life in the country's first openly gay community was a liberating experience, as recounted in a testimony from that era.
Questa vita, se continua così, non mi dispiace affatto. Il cameratismo, tanto screditato dal tenente, in fondo è divertente.
Despite nearly 100 years passing, the suffering has not ended for the gay community in Italy. While they are no longer chained or sent to islands as prisoners, homosexuals are still not considered first-class citizens. This is evident in the fact that the state does not extend any legal rights to same-sex couples, laying the groundwork for a deeply fascist Italian community that refuses to die. However, confining them to islands as if they were perverts or contagious illnesses was not the only way Mussolini's crude regime had to combat homosexuality among virile Italian men. Prostitution was in an anomalous position in fascist Italy during the mid-40s occupation. Under the fascist regime, state-run brothels with authorized prostitutes were allowed, even encouraged as a normal part of the life of the virile fascist male. Records from the time indicate that society accepted the presence and use of brothels and sex workers. The government did not seem to see the contradiction between promoting prostitution for fascist men and the concept of the good wife for fascist women. However, during the war, this activity posed a significant problem for the Allied occupation forces because many men contracted venereal diseases, adding to an already severe labor shortage. It also posed a serious concern for Italian authorities, not only due to the spread of illegal and unlicensed prostitution, but also because many normally respectable women were drawn into the vice network out of economic necessity, to the detriment of themselves, their families, and society. Although the risk of sexually transmitted infections was present in most scenarios during World War II, one of the places with the highest number of infections was southern Italy. The terrible hunger endured by the population in this region in the last months of the German occupation led many women to offer themselves to soldiers in exchange for food or shelter. According to a report from Allied troops, out of 150,000 women in Naples, approximately 42,000 were engaged in prostitution. Makeshift brothels proliferated throughout the city of Vesuvius, many of which were nothing more than large halls where exchanges of favors took place without any privacy, visible to everyone. Prostitution was also widespread on the city streets, and it was as sad as it was common to find a young man willing to offer his sister's virtue in exchange for a can of food to help the family survive. This situation meant that when the Nazi occupation ended, women were not attacked as in other territories, such as the Netherlands and France, where prostitutes enjoyed a higher status that generated resentment in the population, as seen in the following archival material. The prevailing promiscuity of the time caused a violent epidemic of gonorrhea among Allied troops in the winter of 1943 and 1944. The military authorities, alarmed, reacted by conducting an intense awareness campaign, although it was not enough for the soldiers to take the necessary precautions. Within this campaign, one element would prove somewhat controversial for the soldier who put it into practice. It was a small booklet printed in Italian, featuring large letters that read, "I'm not interested in your syphilitic sister." This pamphlet was supposed to help soldiers avoid daily temptations offered to them on the street, but it actually became a source of unexpected conflicts. The troops, not mastering the Italian language, would sometimes show the paper directly to a Neapolitan who approached them for any other reason or motive. Upon reading the disrespectful reference to their sister, undoubtedly the most outrageous insult for a Southern Italian, the offense was met with immediate retaliation. This led to attacks and killings between locals and Allied troops who were supposed to liberate them. This over-sexualization of Italian society, whether through the promotion of prostitution or the portrayal of the Italian man as a virile male providing satisfaction for ladies, had one and only one responsible figure: Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was responsible for establishing a fascist regime in Italy, built upon the ideas of supremacy, nationalism, and racial purity, which he maintained from 1922 to 1943. Beyond his fixation on sexuality and being considered a depraved or sex addict, the truth is that the reputation of the unrestrained lover and libidinous symbol of Il Duce was well known throughout Italy during his time in power. Furthermore, his sexual appeal was a way of asserting dominance. If no man could match his exploits in bed, no man could challenge him for power. This basic and masculine reasoning was how Il Duce managed his relationship with both power and sex. Great historical dictators, aside from their political personas, often hide a dark side in their private lives. For example, much has been written about Adolf Hitler's sadomasochistic or incestuous behaviors. Regarding Benito Mussolini, however, more documents are emerging that certify the Duce's sexual obsessions with the numerous women who passed through his office. The Italian dictator was a sex obsessive, a sick individual with brutal behaviors. For the fascist leader, making love was synonymous with violation, and his sexual desire was insatiable. Mussolini's amorous escapades have been referenced in numerous biographies, and his chauffeur's memoirs claim that the dictator had relations with over 7,000 women during his rule. According to testimonies from the time, sex with the dictator was fleeting, lasting no more than 5 minutes, during which he showed no concern for the satisfaction of his occasional companions. He behaved like a beast in heat. His megalomania was such that he tried to avoid strong-willed women, or those with a certain initiative, because it nullified and sexually inhibited him. He needed to dominate both inside and outside the bedroom. He enjoyed perverse sex as long as he was the one in control of the relationship at all times, a kind of 50 Shades of Grey with a fascist twist, where Il Duce decided all the terms of the relationship. The dictator had an abusive and perverse habit. Hundreds of love letters arrived at his office daily from all over Italy. The correspondence was sorted into 2 categories: letters from new women and letters from known women. The latter were discarded, and a new filter was applied to the former, leaving a list of names for the police to investigate and verify the physical attributes of the candidates, ensuring that the relationship did not pose any risk to the supreme leader. After the check, Mussolini was shown their photos, and those he selected were invited to share an intimate moment with him. Of all these women, one lover in particular was his great love, Clara Petacci. She was his confidant and chief concubine, for whom he professed a devoted love. which in no way stopped him from satisfying his voracious sexual appetite with many other women, of which Clara was fully aware. In fact, it was precisely her diary that became one of the historical records that allowed posterity to portray the dictator's character, as described by this historian, based on Petacci's diary.
Mussolini, perhaps like other busy executives, I don't know, finds time to ring his lover a dozen times a day, and every time he rings, she writes down. The diary is really scrawled, often with quite short entries, and then she'll flip the page over and scroll down some more.
He met Clara in 1932, at that time being married for 17 years, to his second wife, Rachele Guidi, with whom he had 5 children and from whom he never divorced. He was 49, and young Petacci was only 20. Initially, they used to meet at church on Sundays, and then spend the entire afternoon engaging in wild sexual relations in Mussolini's office, a custom recorded in the young woman's diaries. I kiss him, and we make love with such fury that his screams seem like those of a wounded animal. Petacci described the sexual encounters with the dictator as an almost barbaric act, boasting that sometimes they lasted for hours, copulating until Mussolini's heart hurt. This animalistic lover's fury was expressed by Mussolini himself in his manner of addressing his young lover, noted by her with a mix of fascination and fear in her diary. I love you madly. I would like to devastate you, harm you, be brutal with you. Why does my love manifest with such violence? I feel the need to crush you, to shatter you, a violent impulse. With you, I'm a wild animal. She had her own room in the Palazzo Venezia, where Il Duce set up his government. Additionally, she had her own bodyguards and chauffeur, as if she were the First Lady. Clara was the only one who could contest the love that had, until then, belonged to his wife Rachele, who was also fully aware of her husband's escapades, but accepted them as more of a carnal necessity than a mark of infidelity. The machismo bias that tinted the fascist ideology is clearly distinguishable in these aspects of the relationship of the authoritarian Italian leader. Some authors claim that Mussolini had some kind of illness that constantly obsessed him with brutal and violent sex. However, this seemed to fascinate Clara, who, at the moment of Duce's capture, chose to stay with him and die by firing squad instead of escaping, as immortalized in this archive.
The bodies of the ex-dictator, his mistress, and fellow fascists were left lying in the square, and the enraged Italians took the opportunity of kicking them and flinging rubbish on them.
The minorities and dissidents endured hell during the reign of terror of Nazism in 20th century Germany. Lesbians were no exception to the rule, but their treatment was different because the Nazis considered women to be appendages of men's existence. In today's video, we will recount the experience of homosexual women throughout the Third Reich and the tragedies they had to endure. Welcome to a new installment of military history. Let's begin. During the Weimar Republic, German society underwent complex social, political, and cultural transformations. On one hand, the country was marked by political turmoil and violence, along with economic difficulties. On the other hand, Germans enjoyed greater political and social freedoms, leading to visible artistic movements, expanded press, and increasingly noticeable alternative cultures, especially in major cities like Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt. During that time, different lesbian communities emerged, forming clubs and social associations to foster networks and connections to protect themselves from conservative scrutiny. The most famous lesbian associations were the Violetta and Monbijou women's clubs in Berlin, which held informal meetings in bars and clubs such as Monakel d'El and the most famous and crowded of all, El Dorado. Legislative changes and the relaxation of sexual morals after World War I allowed lesbianism to find an outlet in some cabarets in major cities, turning Berlin into a kind of global capital of the LGBT movement, especially during the early years of the Weimar Republic. A significant number of Germans opposed public debates on sex and sexuality, considering them decadent, overly permissive, and immoral. Many citizens were disturbed by the increasing visibility of sex in advertising, cinema, and other aspects of daily life. For these Germans, gay and lesbian communities symbolized what they saw as the degeneration of German society. Various right-wing political groups and dominant religious organizations sought to counteract this aspect of Weimar culture by promoting their version of German culture rooted in classical music and literature, religion, and family. In some cases, these groups blamed sexual deviants, such as lesbians, for corrupting German culture. The emerging Nazi ideology also blamed other minorities, such as Jews, communists, and Roma. Even before coming to power, many Nazis were bothered by the visibility of gay and lesbian communities. They condemned homosexuality, seeing it as a threat to the German people. The Nazi Party officially opposed any attempts to decriminalize male same-sex relationships, arguing that homosexuality was a destructive vice. Hitler's supporters believed that men engaging in unnatural lust among themselves should be pursued with the utmost severity, as such vices would lead to the disintegration of the German people. The progressive rise of conservatism and the eventual ascent of Nazism to power led to the forced closure of these venues, as well as the prohibition of lesbian literature and the weekly magazine for ideal friendship between women called Die Freundin, in order to protect youth from texts deemed obscene and of low quality. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. Shortly after, the gay and lesbian communities in Germany came under pressure and scrutiny from the new totalitarian regime. For men accused of homosexuality, the situation worsened throughout the 1930s, leading to brutal and ruthless persecution. At one point, male homosexuality became a criminal offense, or even worse, as the following testimony recounts.
They called me pedal. Pedal, it means, like in German, schwul, in bad way. Yeah. And therefore I was treated bad. If I were thief, if I were murder, they could accept me, but not this.
By eliminating meeting places and printing presses for gays and lesbians, the regime effectively dissolved the homosexual communities that had developed during the Weimar Republic. Nazism never criminalized sexual relationships between women because they viewed lesbians differently than gay men. This was mainly because lesbians, first and foremost, were women. The Nazis believed that German women had a special and unique role to play: motherhood. According to the party's logic, lesbians were women, and therefore should be mothers. They had the responsibility to give birth to racially pure Germans and thus perpetuate the Aryan race. Female homosexuality was considered a temporary and curable disorder, so they could continue to bear Aryan children. The Nazis concluded that it was easier to directly force Aryan lesbians to have children, which could be considered a violation of these citizens by the state. To encourage the procreation of Aryan children, the Nazis adopted various programs and laws, such as the Lebensborn program, which encouraged Aryan women to have many children, even outside of marriage. At the same time, the Nazi regime tried to prohibit or limit the reproduction of other ethnic groups such as Jews and Roma, while also sterilizing people deemed racially inferior. Other laws, like the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, defined who could have sexual relations with whom, so that respectable Germans would not associate with the riffraff of Europe. Much of German society viewed lesbians as outsiders, people who did not fit into the commonality of the people. Therefore, they were at a higher risk of being reported and then attacked by the Nazi regime. Not all lesbians had the same options. For example, Aryan lesbians had a much better chance of being saved or forgiven for their sexual orientation than Jewish or Romani lesbians, who faced persecution strictly for racial reasons. Aryan lesbians, especially those with more economic resources, tried to hide their sexuality and entered into marriages of convenience, leading secret sexual lives, usually with close friends or domestic employees. Some broke contact with their previous circles of friends, or withdrew from public life to start anew. Others even moved to new cities or the countryside. On the other hand, there were German lesbians who dared to defy the Nazi state for political reasons, seeking underground meeting places where clandestine anti-Nazi resistance centers developed, among other things, helping to hide persecuted Jews, homosexuals, blacks, and Roma. Same-sex relationships were taboo for much of German society. It was common for neighbors, family members, and even friends to disapprove of the involved women and report them to the police. While lesbian relationships were not illegal and did not carry any penalties, the more conservative officers of the Nazi police forces could use background checks as an excuse to intimidate these women. In some cases, the most brutal officers even beat or physically abused women for their sexual choice. The following testimony reveals the anguish of lesbians during that time.
And I was also struggling with my identity as a gay person in a world where we didn't have the kind of support that there is today. And thank God, I am so happy for young people today who are gay, who don't have to go through what I had to, you know.
It is true that there were no legal consequences for lesbians based on denunciations, but they frequently affected women considered socially marginalized. Denunciations could lead to unwanted scrutiny, causing the police to discover or invent criminal offenses. For example, it could reveal connections with a resistance organization, friendship with Jews, or subversive political behavior. In those cases, women were indeed arrested and sent to concentration camps. The example of Elise Müller and Margaret Rosenberg illustrates how the Nazi regime arrested women accused of same-sex relationships on other charges. In 1940, the Gestapo detained and interrogated Müller and Rosenberg based on reports from the women's co-workers. They claimed that the two women had engaged in sexual relationships with other women. The Gestapo asserted that these sexual relationships had interfered with the women's work duties at a Berlin tram station, so they were charged with subversion. Eventually, the two women were deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp, where they were registered as political prisoners with the annotation lesbian written in large red letters next to their surnames. First-hand testimonials, memoirs, and diaries of former female prisoners reveal that they had sexual encounters with each other in concentration camps. According to these sources, the relationships ranged from consensual intimacies to prostitution and brutal sexual assaults. Both heterosexual and homosexual relationships existed in the camps. Some women engaged in sexual relationships with their fellow prisoners. While they were not originally lesbians, certain women developed relationships with individuals of the same sex. describing them as a source of comfort in the camps and necessary for survival.
Te sacaban de la cama a las 7 por la mañana. Esto era la muerte, porque cuando hay -12, -13, y no puedes más soportar porque no tienes nada, tienes este traje y el número aquí, y solo con esto teníamos que ir a trabajar.
Due to the unbearable living conditions and tasks, as narrated in the following testimony, the emotional and physical relationships between individuals of the same sex in the camps could be shocking to other prisoners who came from diverse, generally more conservative cultures and backgrounds. In post-war memoirs and testimonials, some survivors described lesbians in the camps as a threat to the safety and well-being of other prisoners. Others viewed same-sex relationships as an example of degradation caused by the camp experience. These descriptions reflect the extent to which lesbians were often treated as monsters, even by their fellow inmates in concentration camps. However, there are stories that have left a mark on history and have become a banner for LGBTQ+ movements fighting for recognition of their victims during the Holocaust. One such story is the relationship between the Jewish Felice Schragenheim and Lily Elizabeth Wust. Lily, trapped in an unhappy marriage and belonging to the Nazi Party, initially did not know that her beloved was Jewish. When Felice confessed her Hebrew origin, their union was on the verge of breaking, but love prevailed. Not even the repugnant ideology of Nazism could overcome the affection these two women had for each other. This love story inspired a poignant film called Aimé and Jaguar, portraying the tragedy of the two women. Below, we can see a scene from the movie.
Ich bin Jüdin, Lilly. Ich liebe dich.
Before Felice was arrested by the Gestapo in 1944, the two women signed a symbolic marriage contract drafted by themselves in which they pledged eternal love. Obviously, the document had no legal value, but it carried a spectacular poetic weight. Felice did not survive the Theresienstadt concentration camp, but Elizabeth did manage to survive the Holocaust. Historian Monica Alvarez tells us how the story of these women was immortalized in a museum.
Y ahí en ese momento es cuando Lily empieza la lucha incansable por recuperar a su amada. Quiere sacarla de los campos de concentración, quiere recuperarla, quiere que viva. El problema es que al final los nazis acabaron con la vida de Felice, no pudo salvarla, pero hizo algo muy bonito Lily. Hizo un legado a modo de fotografías, de postales, de incluso un diario donde apuntaba todo lo que se habían enviado por correspondencia, ese famoso manual de lágrimas, y todo eso lo llevó al Museo Judío de Berlín y todos podemos disfrutar de ello.
The difference in treatment towards gays and lesbians is based on the distinct consideration of men and women in Nazi society. Due to the misogyny of Nazi ideology, women practically had restricted access to politics and power, so the regime did not consider them a threat to its stability. On the other hand, in the pursuit of increasing the birth rate of the master race, gays were seen as an impediment, while every woman was capable of bearing an Aryan baby, including lesbians who, if necessary, were violated to conceive a little Nazi baby. It would be a mistake to think that women, including lesbians, were more fortunate during those dark years. In essence, the apparent tolerance was another manifestation of female marginalization in Nazi society. Totalitarian regimes often amplify repression by exercising limited tolerance towards certain disapproved groups that are not deemed politically dangerous, allowing these groups to attack the truly marginalized minorities. The classic and sinister strategy of divide and conquer. In this reflective manner, we are reaching the end of today's video. We thank you for watching until the end and look forward to welcoming you in the upcoming installments of Military History.